the end of Jesus's life, he sits with his disciples and he has dinner with them. And at the end of this dinner, he prays. He prays for them. These are the last words that they will hear from Jesus, at least the last extensive words that they will hear from Jesus before he dies. And Jesus says, I glorified you on earth by finishing the work that you gave me to do. Jesus finishes his work. The work that Jesus came to do, it's done. It's done in his lifetime. He leaves knowing that what God has called him to do is complete. And yet it's an odd-looking complete. There's no triumphal return of a king. There's no overthrow of a Roman government. There's no reestablishment of a perfect religion. Everything around the disciples looks not only normal, but that normal is pretty terrible. We talk a lot about returning to normal right now. But I think all of us know that the normal that has been around us is actually not a great normal. It's not the kind of normal that we necessarily want to return to. It's a normal that actually allows for a fragile health system. It's a normal that allows for almost 100,000 people to die. It's the New York Times lead article today. 100,000 people. It's a normal that allows people driving their cars, walking home from the Five and Dime or their local 7-Eleven to be shot because they're wearing the wrong clothing and they have the wrong color of skin. That's not the normal that we want. And the world that the disciples see around them is a very similar kind of normal. It's a world where a Roman soldier could at any point demand that somebody carry the load for them, take clothing off their back, ransack their home, arrest someone on false charges. That's the normal of the world around them. And yet Jesus says his work is done. And then Jesus leaves. I've been thinking a lot about this Feast of the Ascension. Jesus leaves, he's gone. At the end of this prayer, he says, I am leaving. I'm leaving them behind. We talk a lot in our stories and our hymns about Jesus walking with us and Jesus talking with us. And the reality is, Jesus actually isn't walking with us. He isn't talking with us. The truth is, I have never actually met Jesus of Nazareth. I have never touched his hands. I have never put my finger in his side like Thomas did. And yet in this prayer, Jesus says, they will continue my work. The people that are gathered together are Jesus's people. They are God's people because they get that what Jesus is doing is the work of God. They stand and walk in the footprints of all of those followers of God that have gone before them, that have sought mercy and kindness and love and hope and justice. Jesus's role in that, Jesus's time in that, it was actually kind of short. We get 3 years of Jesus's lifetime ministry. That's all we get to see. 3 years of seeing Jesus love people and care for people and sit with people and eat with people and argue with people and debate and sometimes win those debates and sometimes lose those debates. What we see is just 3 years of the work that God gave Jesus to do. And Jesus at the end of his life says it is complete, but it doesn't look complete. And then he says he's leaving, and imagine the despair of the disciples. And then we get this period of time where Jesus comes back. He's resurrected from the dead. Imagine the delight of the disciples, and they think, yes, he's back. He is with us again. We can walk with him and talk with him and eat with him and do all of those things that we did. We will not be alone. This thing that he said, this prayer about him leaving, clearly that was, I don't know, a metaphor, a euphemism. He's back amongst us. And then he leaves again. Gathered together as a community, reinvigorated by the presence of the resurrected Jesus. Jesus has been eating with them and he has been talking with them, and then he is taken up on a cloud again. And I am sure that they are reminded of Jesus's last prayer for them. Jesus's last prayer when he says, the work will continue. Because the work, that is what it means to be in the presence of God. Last week we read about the promise of the advocate and the comforter coming to be with us. That's who's with us. It isn't Jesus. It is the Spirit of God. It is the breath of God that brought all of creation into being. It is the breath of God that went back and forth over the chaos of the waters and brought life and order and flourishing. It is the breath of God that whispered in the ear of Samuel the prophet as a child, as a boy, who raised up then a king, even at the same time warning that kings would be a problem to Israel. It is the same breath of God that whispered in the ear of Miriam and called her to dance for joy when Israel was freed from slavery. It's the same breath of God that whispered in Hannah, Samuel's mother. It is the same whisper that whispered in the Queen Esther to help her save her people from genocide. It is the same God who spoke in Deborah. It's the same God who spoke in the ears of all of those prophets, the one Isaiah who called people to justice, who reminded people that suffering is a part of our human life and God is present with us in that suffering. That is who is with us. It is the Spirit of God, and that Spirit calls us to do the work of God, to follow those commandments, to love all of those around us as best as we are able. Not with the promise of success, but with a persistence that recognizes that we get a short period of time. We have more than 3 years. We get more than 3 years of ministry like Jesus. We get a lifetime, however long or short that lifetime is. For those of us baptized as infants, we are called and committed, sometimes not necessarily on our own behalf. We are called and committed to a life of mercy and justice. And I think many of us have experienced that as something that we can't really avoid. We may have avoided church for a while. We may have avoided the community of God for a while. I've done it. Lots of people have done it. Sometimes we've done it even while attending church. Just because we show up on Sundays doesn't mean we're the community of God the rest of the week. But we cannot resist that call and the Spirit who is with us, who is constantly advocating to us that God loves us and that God calls us to hope and faith and persistence. I've been thinking a lot about advocacy this week, in part because the vote before the City Council for the Levin Housing, that Levin Housing Commission Coalition was advocating for didn't actually happen. Well, it didn't happen because the language of affordable housing had been taken out of the proposal. And a number of commissioners said, you know what, we actually need that language of affordable housing back in. If you want to thank a commissioner, you should thank Joanne Hardesty and Chloe Udaley. I was in the meeting where they said, you know what, it is not okay to pass a proposal that doesn't explicitly call faith communities to build affordable housing. And so there's language going forward to work in affordable housing and some of the technicalities around what that means so that it's a reasonable burden. for faith communities who don't have a lot of money, but want to stake a claim on their little parcel of land and say, we want this land used for what we think it should be used for, not what a developer thinks it should be used for, but what we want it to be used for. And there's no guarantee of success around these things. There's no guarantee. As a matter of fact, I think there was a lot of frustration and despair among the leadership of the Levin Coalition. Levita Gilmore Jones said, this is really frustrating. Rosie over at Ainsworth, UCC, talked about this kind of sense of feeling like, once again, this has been stopped. But then she said, but we just keep on going. She reminded me of Polly Murray. Some of you have heard me mention Polly Murray. I love Polly Murray. Polly Murray sat at lunch counters in Washington, D.C. in the 40s. Polly Murray, in a class, for a class paper, wrote the argument that decades later would be used around used in the arguments around the separation, the arguments around education, the Brown versus the Board of Education. At the time when she wrote it, her colleagues, mostly her male colleagues at Howard Law School, said, this is a ridiculous argument, it can't work. And yet her classmate, Thurman, used that same argument decades later. Polly Murray talks about watching the lunch counter protests that erupted on television, and she was like, you know what, we did this 20 years ago. The things that happened in the 60s weren't invented in the 60s. They were invented much earlier. And that conversation kept happening. And I am sure that when Polly Murray first sat at the lunch counters and were kicked out and nobody seemed to pay any attention, there was a lot of despair on her part. It's how she talks about it. As a matter of fact, Polly Murray sued the University of Georgia for not letting her in to law school. She won the case, but she lost that case. But later on, that case was used as a precedent for subsequent cases. Partly I love her because she is an example of creative working out of the Spirit of God in the world around us, doing new and different things, coming up with creative arguments, and then seeing them fail. And then living long enough to see them succeed decades later in the hands of other people. That's what we do. That's what Jesus did. The work of God in Jesus was done. It was done and it ended on a cross. It ended with death. It ended with what looked to everybody like failure. And the resurrection is that reminder that no, it wasn't failure, that ultimately the glory and the power of God is even over death. But that resurrection in that moment and in that time does not mean that we are freed from death now. It means we are called to enter into the same life that Jesus lived, empowered by the Spirit that is with us. The Spirit that breathes anew, that is creative all the time, that calls us to new things, that calls us to look to the past and bring it forward and redo it, mix it up, and come up with something new that actually then brings new life around us. It's incremental, it's small, it's insufficient. I think it is fair to say that Jesus and his disciples, well, I can't speak for Jesus. I think it is fair to say that his disciples certainly felt like the work that Jesus had done in his lifetime was not finished. It was insufficient in that sense that there's always more to do. But that is the promise of God. That's the promise of God that the Spirit will continue to come and that we will continue to do that work and that we will do it together. Not always agreeing, not always finishing successfully, but continuing to do the work of the Spirit of God. That was the work that Jesus showed us, that Jesus opened us to, that Jesus sets us on the path as we continue to do everything we can to be God's presence in the world by following the commands of God, by loving, by caring, by hoping, by being just, by being merciful, all of those things that we are called to do. That is the work of God that we are called in our lives to complete. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.